I want to tell you today about the onion poultice, a remedy so central to how my mother handled chest congestion that I sometimes think of it as the true signature of our household, the one thing nearly everyone in our community knew us for whenever the subject of home remedies came up. Before I tell you the particulars, though, let me remind you, as I always do, that what I'm sharing comes from memory and family tradition, not medical training. I'm an old woman telling you what my mother did, what was passed down to her, and what we trusted through generations of practice. If a chest cold turns severe, if breathing becomes genuinely difficult, if a fever climbs too high or simply won't break, please see a doctor. That's not a failure of the old ways. That's simply wisdom, the same wisdom my mother carried, knowing exactly when her remedy box had reached its limits. But for the ordinary chest congestion that comes with nearly every winter cold, let me tell you about the onion poultice and why we trusted it so completely. I think to understand this remedy properly, you need to understand a little about chest congestion itself, at least the way my mother understood it, because her whole approach to treating it grew out of a particular way of thinking about what was happening inside a sick child's chest. She believed, as her own mother had taught her, that congestion was something thick and stuck, something that needed warmth and a particular kind of penetrating heat to loosen and break apart so the body could properly cough it up and clear it out. Cold or even lukewarm remedies, in her mind, simply couldn't accomplish this work. What was needed was real, sustained warmth, applied directly to the chest, and onion, prepared in just the right way, provided exactly that. Let me walk you through how she prepared it, because there was a real method to it, refined over years of practice until she could do the whole process almost without thinking, her hands moving through each step with the same confident efficiency she brought to nearly every task in her kitchen. She'd start with a good-sized onion, always a yellow onion if she had the choice, believing it carried more of whatever sharp, pungent quality made the remedy effective compared to the milder white or sweet onions some of our neighbors grew. She'd peel it carefully, then slice it thinly, not so thin that the slices would fall apart, but thin enough that the warming process would properly soften them and release their characteristic strong smell. These slices would go into a pan on the stove, not with any oil or butter, just the onion itself, warmed gently over a low flame, enough to soften and heat the slices through without actually cooking them, without letting them brown or caramelize the way you might if you were preparing them for a meal. She was particular about this distinction, this difference between warming for a remedy and cooking for food, and she'd watch carefully, testing the onion slices periodically to make sure they'd reach the right temperature and softness without going too far. Once the onion had warmed properly, she'd lay the slices onto a clean cloth, usually a piece of soft flannel kept specifically for this purpose, folding the cloth carefully around the onion so it formed a kind of pouch with the onion fully contained inside rather than touching the skin directly. This was important, she always said, because raw or even warmed onion placed directly against the skin could irritate it, especially on a child's more sensitive chest, and the cloth barrier allowed the warmth and whatever beneficial properties the onion released to reach the skin without causing any actual harm or discomfort beyond the smell itself, which none of us ever fully escaped. This warm, fragrant bundle would then be placed directly on the chest of whoever was suffering with the congestion, and we'd lie there, propped up slightly on pillows so we weren't flat on our backs, the poultice resting against our chest, sometimes secured gently with another cloth wrapped around to hold it in place if we were meant to keep it there for a longer stretch. My mother would check periodically, lifting the poultice to glance at the skin beneath, making sure nothing was becoming irritated, and rewarming the onion if it had cooled too much before the treatment time was finished, because she believed the warmth itself was just as important as whatever else the onion might be doing. I remember the particular sensation of lying there with that warm poultice on my chest, the smell filling my nose so completely that after a while I almost stopped noticing it. The warmth seeping through the cloth and settling into my chest in a way that did seem, gradually, to ease some of the tightness and discomfort that came with a bad chest cold. Whether breathing became genuinely easier because of some property in the onion itself, or simply because of the warmth, or perhaps even partly because of the comfort of lying still and being tended to so carefully, I can't say with certainty. But I remember time and again feeling at least somewhat better after one of these treatments, enough that I came to trust the remedy the same way my mother trusted it, without needing to understand exactly why it worked. I want to tell you too about a particular belief my mother held regarding onions that went beyond simply using them as a poultice for someone already sick, because she was equally convinced that onions could help prevent illness from spreading through the house in the first place. During the worst weeks of cold and flu season, she kept cut onions sitting in small bowls placed strategically around the house, one in the kitchen, one in the room where the sick child slept, sometimes even one near the front door, as though she believed the very air passing through our home carried something the onion could help neutralize or clear away. I can't tell you whether there's any real truth to this particular belief, and I confess I've wondered about it myself over the years, but I can tell you that our house, every single winter without exception, carried that distinct onion smell for weeks at a time, woven so thoroughly into the fabric of the season that I still, even now, associate the smell of cut onion with the particular quality of winter light coming through a frosted window. Let me tell you about a specific evening I remember clearly, one that I think captures something important about how seriously my mother took this particular remedy. My older brother, who must have been about 12 at the time, had come down with a chest cold worse than any I remember from my childhood, his cough deep and rattling in a way that worried even my mother, who rarely let worry show on her face in front of us. She prepared the onion poultice that evening with even more care than usual, testing the temperature of the onion against her own wrist before placing it on his chest, checking on him every 20 minutes or so through the evening, rather than her usual half-hour intervals, sitting beside his bed long after the rest of us had gone to sleep, periodically rewarming the poultice when it had cooled. I woke sometime in the middle of that night, needing a drink of water, and found her still there, sitting in the dim lamplight beside my brother's bed, the onion poultice resting on his chest, her hand resting gently on his forehead, her lips moving slightly in what I recognized, even half asleep myself, as quiet prayer. I didn't disturb her, simply slipped past quietly to get my water and back to my own bed. But I remember that image clearly even now. My mother, exhausted herself, refusing to leave her son's side, trusting in her remedy, while also reaching beyond it, toward something larger, asking for help with whatever her onion poultice and her careful nursing couldn't fully provide on their own. My brother recovered within a few more days, his cough gradually loosening and easing the way these things eventually do. And I don't know, even now, exactly how much credit belongs to the onion poultice itself, how much to simple rest and time, and how much to whatever it was my mother was asking for in that quiet midnight prayer. But I know that the whole experience left a deep impression on me. This sense that the remedy itself was never really separate from the love and the faith and the careful attention that surrounded it. That all of these things worked together in a way I couldn't fully untangle, even as an adult looking back on it now. I want to mention too some of the variations my mother and other women in our community used alongside the basic onion poultice, because while the core remedy remained largely consistent, there were small differences in how different households approached it. Some families I knew added a thin layer of mustard to the onion before wrapping it in the cloth, believing the combination provided even more penetrating heat, though my mother generally avoided this particular variation, believing the onion alone was sufficient and worried that the added mustard might irritate a child's sensitive skin too much. Other families preferred to chop the onion rather than slice it, claiming the smaller pieces released their warming properties more readily, though my mother held firmly to her sliced method, believing it allowed for more even, gentle warmth, without the onion pieces shifting around uncomfortably inside the cloth pouch. There was also a related remedy, one my mother used somewhat less often, but that I remember clearly nonetheless, involving onion not as a poultice on the chest, but as syrup taken internally for a particularly stubborn cough. She'd slice an onion thinly, layer the slices in a bowl with a generous amount of honey, and let the whole mixture sit for several hours, sometimes overnight, allowing the onion to slowly release its juices into the honey, creating a thick, pungent syrup that she'd then spoon out a small amount of, several times a day, for whoever was struggling with a deep, persistent cough. I remember this particular remedy being even less pleasant to take than the poultice was to endure, given the strong taste it carried, but my mother insisted it worked wonders for breaking up a stubborn cough, and she kept a jar of this syrup ready in the pantry through much of the winter, alongside her elderberry preparations. I find myself thinking as I share all of this with you today about just how much trust and tradition surrounded something as simple, on the surface, as a sliced onion warmed in a pan. This wasn't a remedy my mother invented herself, nor one unique to our particular family. It moved through entire communities, passed from mother to daughter, refined slightly here and there based on individual preference and experience, but fundamentally consistent across countless households who faced the same winters, the same chest colds, and the same limited access to anything beyond what they could grow, gather, and prepare with their own hands. There's something humbling in that thought, in realizing that this remedy I experienced so personally, lying on my own bed with that warm, fragrant bundle resting on my chest, connected me to so many others living through similar winters, similar illnesses, similar quiet nights of careful nursing by candlelight or lamplight, generation after generation. I want to tell you too about how this remedy fit into the larger rhythm of caring for a sick child in our house. Because the onion poultice was never used entirely on its own, isolated from everything else my mother did to nurse someone back to health. It worked alongside the elderberry syrup taken regularly throughout the illness, alongside the warm broths and teas offered between treatments, alongside the insistence on rest and warmth, and the special quilt brought down for sick days. The poultice itself might have been resting on the chest for only 30 minutes or an hour at a time, several times throughout the day, but the whole atmosphere of care surrounding it extended through every hour, day and night, until the illness had finally passed. I think too about how this particular remedy taught me something about patience and trust that extended well beyond simply treating a chest cold. There was no way to rush the process, no way to force the congestion to clear any faster than it was going to clear on its own, regardless of how many onion poultices we applied or how carefully my mother prepared them. The remedy worked, when it worked, slowly and gradually, requiring repeated application over hours and sometimes days, requiring faith that the process was helping even when improvement wasn't immediately obvious. I think this taught all of us, in some quiet way, something about how real healing tends to work in general, rarely all at once, rarely through some single dramatic intervention, but through patient, repeated, careful attention over time. I hope in telling you all of this today that you've come away with more than simply instructions for preparing an onion poultice, though I do hope you'll try it yourself the next time a chest cold settles in deeply and won't seem to budge. I hope you've come away too with some sense of the careful tradition, the patient love, and the quiet faith that surrounded this particular remedy in our household, and in so many households like ours throughout the wider community we belong to. I want to remind you before I let you go today, just as I always do, that this is an old remedy from a different time, passed down through generations who had little else to rely on beyond what they could prepare with their own hands. If a chest cold turns severe, if breathing becomes truly labored, or if fever climbs too high and won't break, please see a doctor. That remains simply good sense, every bit as true now as it was when my mother knew precisely the limits of what her onion poultice could accomplish. But for the ordinary chest congestion that visits nearly every household at some point through the winter months, I hope there's something here today worth trying, worth remembering, a warm, fragrant bundle of sliced onion, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, resting against the chest, while patient hands and a watchful heart do the rest of the careful work that no remedy on its own can ever fully accomplish. I want to tell you too about a particular conversation I remember overhearing between my mother and one of our neighbors, a woman who lived perhaps a mile down the road and who had a slightly different approach to the onion poultice than my mother did, one that sparked a friendly but genuine disagreement between them that lasted in one form or another for years. This neighbor believes strongly that the onion should be applied directly to the bare skin, without the cloth barrier my mother always insisted upon, claiming that the cloth diminished whatever benefit the onion provided, blocking too much of its power before it could properly reach the chest beneath. My mother disagreed firmly, having seen in her own experience instances where direct application had left a child's sensitive skin red and irritated, sometimes worse than the original chest cold itself. The two women would discuss this particular point whenever they happened to meet, each holding firmly to her own method, neither ever quite convincing the other, though I noticed they remained good friends regardless, each respecting that the other had her own hard-won experience behind her particular approach. I bring up this small disagreement because I think it illustrates something true about how these old remedies actually functioned within our community, despite how consistent they might seem when described simply, the way I've been describing the onion poultice to you today. In truth, there was always a degree of variation, of individual adaptation, of women trusting their own observed experience over whatever the supposedly standard method might dictate. My mother's particular insistence on the cloth barrier came not from some universal rule everyone agreed upon, but from her own careful observation over years of practice of what worked best and caused the least additional discomfort for her own children's particular skin and constitution. I remember, too, a winter when onions themselves became unusually scarce in our area, following a poor harvest the previous autumn that had left our own root cellar with far fewer onions than usual. And I watched my mother navigate this scarcity with the same careful resourcefulness she brought to everything else. She rationed what onions we had carefully, reserving them strictly for the poultice rather than using them freely in cooking the way she normally would. And on the occasions when we ran entirely out before a fresh supply could be obtained through trade with a neighboring family who'd had better luck with their own harvest, she turned to alternatives, using garlic in a similar warmed poultice, believing it carried at least some of the same warming, penetrating qualities, even if she considered it a less effective substitute than her preferred onion. This adaptability, this willingness to find alternatives when the preferred remedy simply wasn't available, strikes me now as an important part of the whole tradition, something easy to overlook when we focus only on the remedies themselves rather than the resourcefulness required to maintain them through difficult years. My mother never simply gave up and did without when circumstances made her usual approach impossible. She adjusted, she substituted, she found another way forward, drawing on the same deep well of accumulated knowledge that informed the original remedy in the first place, applying that same underlying logic, warmth, penetration, gentle application through a protective cloth barrier, even when the specific ingredient available to her had to change. I think, too, about how the children in our house came to understand and even participate in this remedy as we grew older, because by the time I was perhaps 10 or 11, I'd watched my mother prepare so many onion poultices that I could do much of the process myself, under her supervision, when one of my younger siblings fell ill. I remember the particular pride I felt the first time she let me slice the onion myself for a poultice meant for my youngest sister, watching carefully as I worked to make sure the slices were neither too thick nor too thin, feeling even at that young age like I was being entrusted with something genuinely important, something that connected me to my mother's own careful tradition, and through her, to her mother before her, and to all the women in our community who'd practiced this same careful art of warming, wrapping, and tending across so many generations. This sense of being taught, of having knowledge passed down deliberately and carefully from mother to daughter, feels important to mention here, because I don't think these remedies survived simply by accident or by being absorbed passively through mere exposure. My mother was deliberate about teaching us, about explaining not just what to do but why, about the importance of testing the onion's warmth before applying it, about watching the skin carefully throughout the treatment, about understanding when a child's discomfort had crossed some line that required different action entirely. This deliberate teaching, I believe, was just as much a part of preserving the remedy across generations as the remedy itself, ensuring that each new generation of mothers in our community understood not just the mechanical steps, but the underlying wisdom and care that gave those steps their real meaning. I hope in sharing these additional memories with you today that you've gained a fuller sense of just how much depth and tradition surrounded this seemingly simple remedy, how it connected not just to treating illness in the moment, but to broader questions of resourcefulness, individual adaptation within a shared tradition, and the deliberate, loving teaching that passed this knowledge from one generation to the next. There was nothing simple in the end about a sliced onion warmed gently in a pan, not when you consider everything that surrounded it, the careful method refined over years, the small variations between households, the resourceful adaptations during scarce years, and the deliberate teaching that ensured daughters like myself would carry this knowledge forward into our own households, our own years of caring for sick children through the long, cold winters that never seem to end quite as quickly as we'd like. Thank you truly for sitting with me today, for letting an old woman tell you about onion-scented winters and the quiet, patient nursing that filled our house through every cold season I can remember. There's so much more I could tell you, and I do hope you'll come back and visit again soon. Take care of your chest and take care of yourselves.